Most calls that reach law enforcement have ordinary explanations. This one didn't. On a quiet afternoon in the Florida Keys, someone reported what appeared to be a body lying just beyond a narrow roadside access road, hidden beneath thick brush. At first, deputies considered the possibility of an accidental drowning. Strong currents weren't uncommon in the area, and bodies had been recovered from the surrounding waters before. But that theory began to unravel almost immediately. As the scene was secured, investigators noticed details that didn't fit an accident. The victim, an adult woman, had no identification, no clothing, and nothing that could reveal who she was. More troubling were the injuries. Marks around her neck suggested compression rather than drowning, while abrasions across her body hinted at a violent struggle. Then came another unsettling realization. Blood and disturbed vegetation indicated she hadn't died where she was found. Someone had brought her there, leaving her body hidden just far enough from the road that it might never have been discovered if a passerby hadn't looked in the right direction. What began as a possible recovery had quickly become a homicide investigation. Every minute now mattered. Surveillance footage could be erased, witnesses could forget what they had seen, tire tracks could disappear beneath the next passing vehicle. The crime scene became a puzzle where even the smallest detail could change everything. Fresh tire impressions crossed the gravel entrance leading toward the brush. Several broken branches hung unnaturally over a narrow path, as though something or someone had recently forced their way through. Along that same route, investigators recovered strands of hair that appeared to form a silent trail between the roadway and the place where the victim had been left. Each clue raised more questions than answers. Who was she? Where had she been killed? And who had gone to such lengths to hide her body? Teams divided their responsibilities. Crime scene technicians meticulously documented every inch of the recovery area, while detectives expanded outward, searching nearby roads and businesses for anything that might establish the victim's final movements. Yet every lead seemed to end at the same obstacle. No one knew her name. Without an identity, investigators couldn't retrace her last known hours, speak with family, or determine who might have wanted her dead. Before they could begin hunting for a killer, they first had to answer a far more basic question. Who was the woman lying beside that isolated Florida road? Identifying the victim had become the investigation's highest priority. Without a name, detectives had little chance of reconstructing her final days or discovering who had crossed paths with her before she was killed. While forensic teams continued processing the crime scene, other investigators spread across the Florida Keys, racing against time before surveillance footage disappeared and memories began to fade. Their first stops were local businesses. Bars, restaurants, convenience stores, and gas stations all became part of the search. Detectives carried a photograph of the victim, asking employees the same difficult question over and over. Have you seen this woman? Most people quietly shook their heads. A few thought she looked familiar, but couldn't remember where they had seen her. Hours passed with little progress, and every unsuccessful conversation made the investigation feel increasingly urgent. Then everything changed. Two bartenders, working at different establishments, independently recognized her face. Neither knew her name, but both remembered seeing her regularly around town. More importantly, each recalled that she worked at a nearby restaurant. It was the first solid lead investigators had received. Detectives drove there immediately. The restaurant manager looked at the photograph for only a moment before recognizing her. Her name was Michelle. She was 51 years old and had moved from Wisconsin to Florida, hopping for a fresh start. Life hadn't been easy. She had struggled with addiction and periods of homelessness, but the people who worked alongside her remembered someone who showed up, worked hard, and treated others with kindness despite her own circumstances. There was one topic she returned to again and again. Her children. Co-workers recalled that Michelle often spoke about rebuilding those relationships. No matter how difficult life had become, she never stopped believing she could reconnect with her family one day. Now, detectives faced the painful task of notifying relatives hundreds of miles away that those hopes would never become reality. For investigators, however, Michelle's identity was only the beginning. Now they could start retracing her final days, identifying the people she had spent time with, and uncovering the events that led to her death. While that work was underway, another team made a discovery that would quietly shift the direction of the entire investigation. Near the crime scene, forensic specialists had recovered several broken pieces of plastic hidden beneath freshly snapped branches. At first glance, they appeared insignificant, just fragments of damaged vehicle trim. But after carefully examining photographs and comparing the pieces to manufacturer designs, an automotive specialist reached an important conclusion. The plastic most likely came from a full-size Dodge conversion van. For the first time, investigators weren't searching blindly anymore. They now had a specific vehicle to look for. Detectives returned to the growing collection of surveillance footage they had gathered from businesses across town. This time, instead of searching for an unknown person, they focused on one question. Could they find a damaged Dodge conversion van moving through the area around the time Michelle disappeared? Camera after camera revealed nothing. Then, finally, one recording captured exactly what they had been hoping to find. A silver and black Dodge conversion van with fresh damage was seen driving through town only hours before Michelle's body was discovered. It wasn't enough to identify a killer, but it was enough to identify a suspect. When investigators traced the vehicle's registration, they found themselves looking at a name that would immediately change the course of the case. The registration led investigators to a local man named Stephen Matthew Wolfe. At that moment, all they knew was that his vehicle closely matched the damaged van captured on surveillance footage and appeared consistent with the broken plastic recovered near the crime scene. It was a significant lead, but not enough to draw conclusions. The next step was finding him. By then, the van had disappeared from every available camera. Its last confirmed sighting placed it somewhere within a busy commercial district filled with restaurants, retail stores, and sprawling parking lots. Rather than waiting for another tip, deputies spread across the area after dark, methodically checking every location where a large vehicle could remain unnoticed. The search continued for hours. Then one deputy spotted something that immediately caught his attention. Parked quietly between two businesses sat a silver and black Dodge conversion van. Even from a distance, the fresh damage was visible. Officers carefully established positions around the vehicle, moving nearby civilians away while waiting for additional units to arrive. No one knew who might be inside, whether the driver was armed, or what evidence could still be waiting in the van. The parking lot fell silent. Then the commands came. Stephen Wolfe stepped out from the driver's side with his hands raised. To the surprise of many officers, he offered no resistance. He was taken into custody without incident. But the investigation was only beginning. The damaged section of the van appeared to match the missing plastic recovered near the place where Michelle's body had been found. If laboratory testing confirmed the connection, investigators would have far more than a suspicious vehicle. They would have a direct physical link between the crime scene and Stephen's van. Search warrants were obtained almost immediately. As forensic specialists began processing the interior, one detail stood out before any testing had even begun. There was a strong odor inside the vehicle that prompted investigators to conduct an especially thorough examination. What they uncovered only deepened their suspicions. Investigators recovered blood evidence, blonde hairs, disturbed bedding, and several other items that were carefully collected for laboratory analysis. On their own, none of those discoveries proved exactly what had happened. Together, however, they painted a far more troubling picture. Michelle had almost certainly been inside that van shortly before her death. Even so, experienced detectives knew that suspicion alone would never secure a conviction. Every piece of evidence would eventually be challenged in court. Every timeline would be questioned. Every forensic result would have to withstand scrutiny. There was another reason investigators remained cautious. As they continued digging into Stephen Wolf's background, they discovered he was no stranger to law enforcement. His history included serious acts of violence dating back decades, along with reports describing years of instability and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. None of that proved he had murdered Michelle, but it left investigators approaching every decision with heightened caution. The physical evidence was growing stronger. Now they needed to hear Stephen explain why his damaged van, his movements, and the emerging forensic evidence all seemed to place him at the center of the investigation. Before long, detectives would sit down with him for the first interview. And from the very beginning, Stephen's own words would create even more questions than answers. Less than 24 hours after Michelle was believed to have been killed, Stephen Wolf sat inside an interview room at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. By then, investigators had already connected his damaged van to the crime scene. Forensic specialists were still processing evidence from inside the vehicle, while detectives continued interviewing anyone who might have crossed paths with Michelle during her final days. The case was taking shape. Now they wanted to know whether Stephen would help explain it or make it even more suspicious. Detective Matt Pitcher entered the room without immediately mentioning Michelle's death. Instead of launching into accusations, he allowed Stephen to speak freely, asking him to describe the previous day in his own words. The strategy was simple. People telling the truth usually remain consistent. Those hiding something often create details that become impossible to defend later. Stephen appeared calm. He explained that he had been driving around the Florida Keys searching for a place to park his van. During that drive, he claimed, he accidentally brushed against overgrown vegetation, damaging the vehicle. The statement immediately caught investigators' attention. Without realizing it, Stephen had placed himself exactly where detectives already believed Michelle's body had been abandoned. Outside the interview room, the investigation continued to move forward. Witnesses from the local homeless community began coming forward after learning about Michelle's death. Several reported seeing her with Stephen in the days leading up to the murder. One man voluntarily contacted investigators after realizing he had recently ridden inside Stephen's van. Another described Stephen as someone well known around town, but admitted he was shocked to learn Michelle had been found dead. Then detectives uncovered an even more significant connection. Michelle hadn't simply known Stephen. According to multiple witnesses, she had been staying inside his van during the days before she disappeared. That revelation dramatically narrowed the timeline investigators needed to reconstruct. As interviews continued, detectives spoke with a man named Terry, who knew both Michelle and Stephen. At first, Terry appeared reluctant to get involved, but as the conversation continued, he acknowledged speaking with Stephen shortly before Michelle's death and described repeated arguments between the two. According to Terry, the relationship had become increasingly volatile. He also claimed Stephen had threatened Michelle on more than one occasion. Those statements couldn't establish guilt on their own, but they fit an emerging pattern. Meanwhile, laboratory testing on the van continued producing critical results. Investigators recovered blood evidence, blonde hairs consistent with Michelle, and additional biological material from inside the vehicle. Combined with surveillance footage, witness interviews, and Stephen's own admission that he had been near the crime scene, the growing body of evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Still, one major question remained unanswered. What had actually happened inside that van? Detectives believed Stephen knew the answer. The only uncertainty was whether he would continue telling the same story, or whether mounting evidence would force him to change it. By the time detectives interviewed Stephen Wolfe for a second time, the investigation had changed dramatically. His damaged van had been linked to the crime scene. Witnesses placed Michelle inside the vehicle before she disappeared. Surveillance footage tracked the van through town, while forensic testing continued to strengthen the case against him. Investigators weren't relying on a single piece of evidence anymore. They were building a timeline. Detective Matt Pitcher once again asked Stephen to explain what had happened. This time, his story changed. Instead of claiming he had simply been driving around town, Stephen now said another man had attacked Michelle inside the van while he was behind the wheel. According to Stephen, he panicked after the assault. Rather than calling 911 or seeking help, he claimed he helped dispose of Michelle's body before driving away. It was a dramatically different version of events. But as detectives compared Stephen's new account with the physical evidence, the explanation began to fall apart. The description he gave of the alleged attacker failed to match what investigators had learned from witnesses. More importantly, the forensic evidence inside the van pointed investigators back to Stephen, not to an unknown third person. Laboratory testing confirmed Michelle's DNA on multiple items recovered from inside the vehicle. Blood evidence supported investigators' belief that she had been assaulted there, while surveillance footage, witness testimony, and crime scene reconstruction formed a timeline that prosecutors argued could not be explained by Stephen's changing stories. He never confessed to murdering Michelle. Instead, prosecutors told the jury that his repeated changes in explanation reflected an effort to distance himself from mounting evidence that continued to point in one direction. When the case finally went to trial, jurors heard days of testimony from detectives, forensic specialists, crime scene analysts, and witnesses who helped reconstruct Michelle's final known movements. Together, their testimony told the story of an investigation that began with an unidentified woman found beside a secluded Florida roadway and ended with investigators methodically identifying the victim, tracing a damaged vehicle, locating its owner, and connecting each piece of evidence until the picture became impossible to ignore. In 2023, Stephen Matthew Wolfe was found guilty of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the assault and the concealment of evidence. During the penalty phase, the jury unanimously recommended a sentence of death, and the court later imposed that sentence. For Michelle's family, the verdict delivered accountability, but it could never restore what had been taken from them. Those who knew Michelle remembered far more than the difficult circumstances of her final years. They remembered a woman who never stopped hoping life could improve. Despite addiction, homelessness, and years of hardship, she continued talking about rebuilding her relationships with the children she loved. That hope ended beside a quiet road in the Florida Keys. Yet even after the conviction, one question continued to trouble the detectives who investigated the case. As authorities reviewed Stephen Wolfe's past, they uncovered a history of serious violence stretching back decades, including a homicide conviction from his youth and an escape from custody before he was eventually recaptured. Detective Matt Pitcher has publicly stated that certain aspects of Stephen's past, combined with gaps in his movements over the years, have left investigators wondering whether Michelle may have been his only victim. To this day, however, no additional homicide convictions have linked Stephen Wolfe to any other killings, and law enforcement has never publicly confirmed the existence of other victims. Those suspicions remain exactly that, suspicions, not established fact. Michelle's killer was identified. He was arrested. He was convicted. And he was held accountable in court. But if investigators' unanswered questions are ever proven true, there may still be stories that have never been told, and victims whose names have yet to be discovered. Sometimes a case reaches a verdict. That doesn't always mean every mystery has been solved.